Guten Abend.
Good evening to you all. A warm welcome
Zu unserer Veranstaltung
to
Ökonomie.
today's event, Care Economy, Ökonomie der Fürsorge. My name is Imme Scholze. I'm one of the chairs of the Heinrich-Böll-Foundation, and I am delighted to be able to welcome you here tonight and to lead you through this issue that is a very current and important one. You might have noticed we will switch between English and German. Should you need interpretation, please grab a headset. You will find them at the entrance.
Und herzlich willkommen, Tim Jackson.
And warm welcome to you, Tim Jackson, of course. I'm very happy to be able to welcome you here in our Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Your new book, The Care Economy, is the third book published and translated together with the editorial into German. And with the first book, Prosperity Without Growth, has made you popular worldwide. You've become famous. And the question is, how do we want to live if it is not about more growth in our economy, but more riches? And in this new book, you focus on a new relationship between the care economy and social responsibility, and with views to our society, an overaging society. I am aging myself. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. It is good if we're able to age, but it is definitely a deviation when we look at the different age groups, and it is not about ageism or discriminating age, but the observation of our society has to do with the deviation of the different generations, the consequences of the COVID pandemic, and the gaps that we see in the society, in our health services that have to do with very bad working conditions for skilled workers, exploitation of women because of non-paid care work. And this shows us that we as a society have to find other alternatives, better ways of caring for one another, because without that care, nobody will flourish. And with that new book, Tim Jackson leads us down a new pathway to think about and beyond traditional economic models, to place the human into the center of attention. And in that economy would be not only the production of more things and more materialist things, but to find a prosperity that is comprehensive for all, that stems from the bodily wholeness and mental wholeness of the bodies. And this would not only be of central importance for individuals and families, but would also foster stability and coherence in our society. In the book, we will find another important issue, which is a huge criticism of patriarchy. Tim Jackson makes patriarchy responsible for the worsening of the care economy. Fuck patriarchy. And this leads us over to feminist literature on care economy, those carers that have been pursued as witches, and the insight of anthropological research that the patriarchal system, where men between them do support one another and subdue women, and this has shifted societies that are based on respect and mutual recognition, and they have been structured in a matriarchal structure. And one insight of the book is not necessarily to oppose matriarchy to patriarchy, but that it has to be a society that builds upon the relationship and the partnership in the couples. But if we are able to move over to the care economy, the patriarchy has to be done away with, because only then violence to the benefit of care can be under control. But tonight, we will look into what that means, health as a societal goal, and what would be necessary in order to establish care as an organizational goal, and how could we shape the care economy where health and prosperity or well-being of the people would be in the center of attention. And today we have the opportunity to learn from two senior experts. Apart from Tim Jackson, we have what is Friederike Habermann. Warm welcome to you here to the Foundation. Both will explain the concept of the care economy, and with the help of the book will lead us to the different locations and help us think about different solutions that are economically sustainable and socially just. As you might see, there is a table outside where you will be able to purchase the book if you wish. And we have displayed another publication of Ina Pretorius that is called Economy is Care. You can find it on the first floor, on the bottom, on the ground floor. And with that, I would wish us all very interesting insights in the care economy, and I would invite you to become actively involved in the discussion. With that, I hand over to you, Friederike.
Ja, herzlich willkommen.
Well, warm welcome from my side.
Und auch von mir.
And from me as well, of course. It is my honor to be able to talk to you, Tim, about your new book, The Care Economy.
Ich ergänze vielleicht zu der...
I might compliment on what's been said. I'm an economist and historian and a free scientist for decades, but since yesterday I have a professorship of economy, so therefore this is really fitting for that event.
Und offen gestanden war ich mir nicht bewusst, dass ich...
I have to admit that I wasn't aware that there was no such thing as a moderation. And as I learned about it, I'll say, okay, we'll see how that works out. And we had a brief briefing, so I had the opportunity to learn a little bit more, and I will be your moderator, but it's going to be more of a conversation. Thank you so much for your availability to do that with me. So I look at all those little papers because I've scribbled down a few English terms, but we have come to terms with me speaking German and he's speaking English, and we've jumped from one of those, spoken a lot of English, so we try to stick to each languages to not confuse the interpreters as well. Tim. So we are a bit of an older age. I think we have had a longer friendship, and sometimes it takes a while between one meeting and another. So what does happen if you meet someone you haven't met for quite some time? If she would ask you what's very important about that book? That's an interesting question. Thanks, first of all, for the invitation and for assuming that position. I'm quite appreciative. And I'd like to excuse myself because I'm not going to be able to speak German the whole event through. It's not going to be very entertaining for you or for you all. So I think it's a better idea to switch over to English.
I would just say that it's not a question of willingness or even, in some sense, my ability to talk in German for an hour or so. But I have been reminded a couple of times that my German is limited. I think Barbara Unmercig, very kindly told me that it sounded like I'd learnt my German in Second World War films when we first met, which I think is partly true. and then I learnt a little more German with my partner Linda, who is here tonight, but I was told that I should be aware that I'm not necessarily always speaking the right kind of German when I learnt it at home with her, and it's not always to be brought out in public. So, and I think that's also a wise advice. So for the most part, I will speak a little English. I might fall into German every now and then, and I might even request to Frieda that she repeats the question in English if I haven't understood it, and I apologize in advance for that. So what would I say to an old friend I hadn't seen for some time about the book? I would say that it's a book that's been a long time coming, and probably from before I ever met them, because in some sense the question of care comes at us very, very early on in the acknowledgements. And in fact, the dedication to the book is to my mother, from whom I clearly first learnt about care in both a direct and an indirect way. And more recently, it is a theme that was very much present in Prosperity Without Growth, but had not been fully articulated. I articulated in Prosperity Without Growth, I articulated the idea that when we think about the economy that would deliver us prosperity, with or without growth, it had certain characteristics, and these were the characteristics of what in that book I called care, creativity, and craft. And these activities shared certain characteristics, which together, I think the term the care economy captures. I called it in Prosperity Without Growth, I called it the Cinderella economy, because in some sense these sectors, these activities, these economic ideas sit outside what the conventional economy prioritizes and prizes. And I wanted to center that as a concept for a different kind of economy, an economy that would work with or without growth, an economy that would tell us wie wir wollen, wie wir leben wollen, and I wanted to explore, I think at the outset for myself, what this concept of a care economy would look like. But then very quickly, as I began to delve into my reading, into the literature, into my thinking about how to write the book, there is a sense in which the idea of the care economy is blindingly obvious, that care is the fundamental foundation for life. In fact, the sense that I developed in the book, that I wanted to bring out in the book, that it's actually the fundamental organizing principle of organic life, that care is that, and it's definable as that. But in some sense, that's so blindingly obvious, and has also been pointed out by many people before, that a part of my journey in the book, and really what the book ended up being, was a slightly different question. If something is so blindingly obvious, then why does the blindingly obvious not happen? And that was as much what I was trying to get at in the book.
Ja, du zitierst jemanden,
You quote someone
Bücher sind
who's saying that books are for children, and they come through us, but they're not made by us. And this is something that I absolutely feel. So the books are produced like children. And you do describe that there has been a certain shift when you were writing. Do you want to explore that first? So take us on that journey, what you thought this book would be like and how this changed along the way.
In which it changed, really. I mean, the first was this sense that I mentioned just now, that in a sense, you know, why do I need to write a book about the blindingly obvious? And then it became clear that actually it was why the blindingly obvious didn't happen, that's what I should write the book about, which was a sort of sense of the book taking me in a different direction. There was a couple of other things, I suppose, that sidetracked me, if that's the right word for it, or they led me to where they wanted me to go. And one was actually something that I stumbled on really through the process of writing very early on, which was that I was sitting down to write about the care economy at a point in time at which I thought there would be a greater receptivity to the idea of care, because we had stood on our doorsteps applauding care workers and through the pandemic, and the pandemic itself gave us a centering of care. It provided a kind of focus on care that in some sense we had to recognize that this was the foundation for society. We had to protect that foundation. We had to go forwards. So I thought I was writing into an open space, into a place which would be receptive to those ideas. But very quickly after that, I found that I felt as though we were living in a very different world. I sat down to write at the end of 2021, and I began seriously writing, I suppose, the beginning of 2022, almost 3 years ago. That's how long a book takes to gestate, I suppose. In this particular case, that's how long it took. But in the beginning of 2022, of course, world events changed, and all of a sudden we were living in a world that was plummeting headlong towards not care, but violence. And there was quite a long period of time where I began to think I couldn't write the book at all because there's partly a sense of impotence about that world that we were throwing ourselves into, but also a sense that it would pass everybody by. It would be useless. It's totally out of its time. The pandemic is gone. Thank goodness it's gone. We don't have to think about care anymore. Let's think about violence instead. What on earth is the point of writing about care in those circumstances? And my way around that, or the way that a book led me around that, was actually in something that a very good feminist sociologist called Kathleen Lynch wrote in a book called Care and Capitalism, in which she basically said, quite forthrightly, you cannot really hope to understand care if you don't face and understand and begin to try to understand care's nemesis, which is violence and war. And it was this actually that began to make me realize it took me in a different direction in the book. It was a different book because of what happened in geopolitical terms, but it began to make me realize that this was not the wrong time to be writing about the care economy, but precisely the right one. And then there was I don't know if you want me to say all the twists and turns of me writing the book, but there's also in the book, there is it became a kind of journey. It became almost a kind of journal in places. And as part of that journal, I had various health concerns of my own, which we don't necessarily have to go into, but are in some sense a way for me to talk about the journey of the book in ways that relate to health and care. And that was also unforeseen at the beginning of writing, for sure.
Wo du sagst, du hast lange gebraucht, das Buch zu
You're saying it did take you while writing that book,
auf sehr angenehme Art und Weise
and
zu lesen.
it is very comfortable to take a while for reading it because it's not necessarily a non-fiction book. And you have been a playwright before.
Sehr stark. Also ich finde es da
This is something that you definitely feel while reading that book. You have achieved quite a good quality and quite different as compared to your previous books. So it was a good read.
mit meinem Bänderriss die letzten
I just injured my knee, as you can see. And when I woke up during my nights staying awake, I was reading your book, and I was quite surprised to see that you had this scene in your house where you fell, and the next time I was reading during a morning, I came to that scene where, because I was supposed to take analgesics for the
dann hatte ich es erst rausgezogen.
pain and to take protein pump inhibitors. And then I was reading absolutely the same story and your skepticism that you display when you talk about school medicine and a bit of an alternative medicine, theory and
Verdrängte Natur,
therapy,
Medizin, auch mit dieser Aschenputtel.
and to have a bit of a Cinderella idea.
Vielleicht dazu, dass es Care so ein sehr
And in general leads to the fact that care is focused very strongly on medicine and medical aspects,
Zusammenhängen so nicht kenne, sondern
which I have not seen in other care-related topics, where it is all about trying to care for your life. And the Cinderella part in the feminist economy, we always talk about the image of an iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg is the economy that you can see, where prices are paid, wages are paid, and down below, underwater, you see the bigger chunk of the iceberg, where you see all those activities not paid for, like typical housewife activities that are usually taken over by marginalized people, the subsistence of nature, so every single other way of activity outside. Why did you place such a strong focus on medicine?
I would say that it is one of the focuses of the book on medicine, and that is probably one of those twists and turns that the book sort of imposed on me in thinking about it. But what was interesting to me, I would say care has many different meanings. And one of the things that I was trying to do in the book was to settle almost for myself as a part of this journey, how we could define care in a way that created that idea that it's a central organizing principle that people could understand. Not that it's something that only women do, not that it's only something that's this part of the sector of our economy, not that it's hidden below the water of the iceberg and everything that matters is above the top of it, but actually it is a central organizing principle for organic life. And its role as an organizing principle for organic life is very, very specific. And it seemed to me that it is through health that we understand that role specifically. That's my, if you like, philosophical exploration for why I addressed it in that way. There was another incidental factor, which was that I was focusing on my own health. I was focusing on pain medication. I was focusing on the pharmaceutical industry that produces that. I was focusing on the medicine that had developed as a particular central route towards the care of health, the care of psychological health, as well as the care of physical health, and that this was actually a fundamental turning point within our model of health that had profound implications for how we thought about care and what care is. And it also had a strong way of explaining some of what had gone wrong in the externalization of care from the center of the economy. Not all of what had gone wrong. There were many things that had gone wrong. But in fact, one of these things was a pharmaceutical turn that was brought about in the tradition of health in the early 20th century that was specifically aligned with the rise of capitalism, in which the selling of pharmaceuticals became a very, very profitable industry, and it has systematically undermined another view of health. And that other view of health, like the concept of care, is one that was mainly held by women prior to that turn, particularly through lay healing and traditions of lay healing, and even through ancient traditions of witchcraft, for example, what was denigrated as witchcraft. And it was a way for me of honoring the fact that what, as you say, has been pointed out very clearly as a denigration of a particular sector of society actually has fundamental roots that go a long way back and have been a systematic denigration of care work, of the people who work in care, and in particular that means, of course, of women. And I wanted to, this was partly an exploration for myself, but it was also partly a way of looking at what is a huge crisis that we face at the moment, a crisis of health, which is of a very different nature to the crises of health that we faced back when that turn was made. The crisis that we face in healthcare at the moment is a crisis of chronic disease, and this is established, and the statistics are things that I looked at and are in the book. 74% or 3/4 of global deaths are associated with chronic disease, not infectious disease or accidents. That burden, the financial burden of that chronic disease on our health system is massive. And yet our approaches to it through pharmaceutical treatment are woefully inadequate. They are not ever, and it's also becoming completely unpayable. So there's a sense here that comes right back to the economy, of an economy that has become a careless economy, even in relation to its own health. And we are now saddled with a situation in which we have unpayable healthcare debts because we've accepted a version of health and a version of care which has not allowed us to see properly what the fundamental basis of health is and what the fundamental principle of care is. So, I think in part what I wanted to do, what I was trying to do through that, was to open out a philosophical discussion around care, and I wanted it to be something that would be, and thank you for accepting that or telling me that it's a nice book to read, would be something that people would enter into in a narrative way through a particular set of discussions and incidences and histories and stories and anecdotes, And one of those aspects was very definitely this idea of a kind of turn in our model of health that has tripped us up, systematically undermining the concept of care.
Bevor ich darauf nochmal zurückkomme.
Before coming back to what that concept of care has turned around, this turning point, it has been mentioned. Ida Pretorius has written a booklet published by the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. There was a nice video recorded on that, and we have a very long feminist debate on that. And you are saying quite frankly that whenever you started writing about the issue, that it's no uncovered ground, and that many pioneers have already pushed forward. And after those decades, I think we cannot really even talk about pioneers anymore.
Wenn man dann allerdings ein Buch oder
But
dein Buch anfängt.
Once we start reading your books, being women, then I look at the index, and in the preface I read that we learn to distrust patriarchy. So this is what you start out with criticism on patriarchy, to at least question patriarchy. And I think many don't have the feeling that, or at least other feminist authors that have embarked on that path might think that they are not the target group of readers for that book. So what would you define being your target group of that book? And those who deal with it for quite some time, what can we learn of it?
So let me say a couple of things to that. I mean, I would not exclude that group from my target group in terms of reading about it, because it seems to me that the gendered nature of care concerns everybody. And I point out in the book, and I'm very happy at any point to restate, as you said, that when I was doing my background reading, and it wasn't like I was the first time exposed to it, I didn't set myself up as the pioneer in this strange land. I set myself up as a man, and then realizing that I was tripping on a territory which had long been looked at. And I was very well aware of that as well. And then asking myself the question, what do I have to say here? And do I have anything to say here? And as a man, what do I have to say here? And that question troubled me through the entire writing of the book. And I knew, in fact, there was a chapter in the book, a couple of chapters in the book, 12 and 13. One of them is called Fuck the Patriarchy. And I was journeying towards this chapter in the book from the very beginning without ever knowing how I would address it when I got there, with a deep sense of uneasiness about being there at all. And yet, I guess a couple of things sort of kept me going through that. Not necessarily that there was a different target audience or a specific target audience, but rather that the unresolved question of the gender division of care is something that has to also involve men. And that as a man, I could potentially be a guide through that territory for other men. But for myself, which was really the journey I was going on in the book, I also wanted to find out for myself where, as a man, I stood on that journey in that argument in relation to the gender division of care, in relation to my role as a man. And along the way, I learned from some people, mostly women, almost all women, actually, who had written about it for a very long time, and in ways which I think I wanted to bring forward as shedding light, not just on an argument from one gender against another, or society against the patriarchy, but actually in a way that would bring us forward as an understanding in both genders, and perhaps particularly in men who wouldn't otherwise pick up a book on the care economy, that this central organizing principle matters so intensely that we must sometimes, somehow, overcome our own instinctive positions in relation to the gendered nature of care, and work together on finding what are solutions which have been prevented to us, to all of us, by the institutional architecture of the patriarchy, by the the ripping up of a health model that had been largely held by lay people prior to the medicalization of science, by even possibly from the evolutionary conditions under which we evolved as men and women, and that there were things there that we had to come to terms with, not just for women, not just by women, not certainly by men because suddenly men are taking it seriously and they haven't before, but rather as two genders, as working towards a solution to a dysfunctional world that we had inherited from a set of conditions that actually few people now are directly responsible for, even though some clearly have benefited from more than others. And that was a journey which I, for myself, went on in the book. Let me just finish that long apologia, if it is one, by saying that I have the hugest respect for all those people, and they are mostly women who've written quite similar things in the past.
Ich glaube, also spreche nicht für alle, aber
I wouldn't speak on behalf of all, but I think from my viewpoint, two reasons or why you feel that care is in this subordinate position, or why do we not really care for life? So it's patriarchy on one hand, and then you talk about the disease.
ich glaube, ich würde das wesentlich mehr miteinander verquicken.
I think I would like to intertwine that a lot more. Patriarchy, historically speaking, of course, there have been different forms of patriarchy, but let's say the modern form of patriarchy and the idea of having two genders has to do with the fact that the logics of the market have become dominating ones, that women are defined not only as witches, that witches have been burned, and that the white male identity is come into interaction with the Homo economist, and so rational and emotional has been created, and the different spheres of having a visible economic part and the naturalized economic part. This has all come about, and I was really pleased to see that the bowel mold disease has been so strongly depicted, although they might not be agreeing. But the reproductive activities cannot be monetized as compared to productive activities. And this leads to the fact that we only see an increase in costs in our health system because it's never going to be as cheap as the production. Even Adam Smith is talking about it. In the Middle Ages, the cities that were able to produce more chairs were then working more on the cost of the fields in the periphery, because the potatoes wouldn't grow any faster. And the same gap is to be seen in the industry nations and the developing nations. We will always have this cost pressure. There's always going to be exploitation in the care sector, and therefore within the market economy, there will always be people constructed in order to be as adept as possible for certain activities. Before, it used to be the housewife. Up until the mid of the 20th century, we had empirical studies that women are resistant to monotony and therefore would be more adjustable or more easily to adjust to these kinds of works. And now we have the migrant cleaning lady that should be grateful for having a job. And it should be a win-win situation for both. And it shows that this relationship will not simply be broken down in the market economy and simply lead to a deviation of discrimination. Therefore, it has started out with a feminist discussion with Rosa Luxemburg. It has become stronger. Then the visible part of the iceberg can only produce more value because this part that is below the water is exploited. When Rosa Luxemburg talked about it in her book, Reduction of the Capital, she is writing, I thought it would be something that goes without saying. Well, times where colonies were named colonies, and people were asking her, why do you have to write it down? But instead, she received a shitstorm from all left-wing politicians. They did not want to hear that. Only the strong workers' arm produces productivity and not this exploitation. And now this lady from Bielefeld, she has taken up this issue in the 70s, stating that we have to break down this logic, and we weren't saying that you will live on autarky and grow your own potatoes, but in those areas where market logic does not have a grip, where caring logic works, this would have to extend. This would be the basic principle. And now, the case is that feminist authors are not that readily read, and this might have the reason that things are said that is so far away from our everyday life understanding that it's simply not heard. Because everything we believe in, that people have change markets, that property is not something people were used to. This is not something that you can tell an advisor. And your second book is Post-Growth. The German translation is How We Want to Live. And I would like to know a bit more about that. So the deeper you dig, and I think this is something that you do with your new book, the further we get away from this everyday life understanding, and the less we are heard or rejected. So I'd like to know, in the English-speaking sphere, where capitalism was turned down, I can imagine that the first book wasn't read that easily.
So many points that I'd like to come back on, and all of them absolutely to the point, and also very, very interesting. So I would say I interested myself in this question of labour productivity way back when I was in fact, it was one of the things that came out quite strongly in the first edition of Wohlstand ohne Wachstum, and it came out again in Post-Growth Life After Capitalism, that it is taken as the organizing principle of capitalist economies, the pursuit of labor productivity, what's called labor productivity, this ability that we have to squeeze more and more out of workers. And it's because, roughly speaking, you explained some of it, but labor is a cost to the owners of capital, and so they want as little of it as possible so they can maximize their profits out of the enterprise. And that leads us towards a situation where we want more and more out of our workers for each hour, for every task that they're engaged in. And the reason why this is important, not just as an arbitrary feature of capitalism, but also, and this is where I think I would slightly push back on the idea that these are disconnected issues between culture and the mechanics of capitalism, is because it seems to me that the mechanics of capitalism is the internalization of the institutional internalization of a set of values which have been decided at a particular historical point in time. And that decision to incorporate, institutionalize that set of values around labor productivity is itself value driven. It's driven in values that are associated to some extent with the patriarchy, to some extent with efficiency, to some extent with Marxism, to some extent very much with capitalism, that the pursuit of profit creates a drive for labor productivity, and this is a good thing because it means that we can achieve more. Our output can be more because we can get more out of people for each hour that they work, and this is systematically a good thing, not just for the economy, but for everyone, because it delivers a higher level of well-being. People get higher wages. They get access to, because we're motivated to produce all sorts of wonderful new technologies, which then create what is called quality of life, so that it's a driving force that's instilled in capitalism. And you're right. And in fact, in Post-Growth, I talk about it explicitly, that Rosa Luxemburg had attacked this concept, or attacked the role of capitalism in accumulation in the accumulation of capital in her major work on that, and shown how that means that we constantly have to extract value from outside the realms of capitalism into the arena in order to keep creating that value. An economist would say to that, and this is partly what I guess you're alluding to in saying it, my Wohlstand ohne Wachstum had a particular origin and a particular audience, and it wasn't particularly attacking capitalism. But the argument from within capitalism about that, I think it's important to understand, and it's this, that essentially when you can achieve that labor productivity, you can potentially pay your workers more, you can have cheaper products, you can expand your profit line, and you don't need to extract value from outside the system itself, because it's all coming from this magical formula of increased efficiency, technological advanced and labor productivity. Now, Baumol was one of the people who pointed out that this drive is what creates the schism between what we're calling the care economy and what an economist would call the productive economy, if you like, a sort of productive economy. And Baumol actually called it the stagnant economy, as though it was something that we just wouldn't want at all. It was a bad thing. In his early writings in particular, he was trying to rescue us from what he called Baumol's disease. But actually in his later writings, he comes around precisely to the point that I was trying to make in Wohlstand ohne Wachstum, which is actually this stagnant economy is the one that is the foundation for our quality of life. It's the place where we have healthcare, we have education, we have crafting of products that last for a long time. We have the creative arts. Creative arts was actually his initial example in his very first paper on the Baumol disease, because it's a place where if you play Schubert's Death and the Maiden faster and faster, it doesn't bring you much. It begins to destroy the quality of the product. And from that point, he then began to also talk, this same dynamic is happening in health, because it's the attention that care demands that takes up time, which is its barrier to this drive for labor productivity. And I was very taken with that in Wohlstand ohne Wachstum, because it seems to me it's a systematic device within capitalism itself that constantly keeps us away from the care economy. And I wanted to recognize actually that as a structural device, but also recognize that it's a structural device that's coded into capitalism, which is itself an institutional structure which codes for a set of societal values, which has been laid down in large part, of course, by the patriarchy. So it was this journey between the way the structural dynamics of the Baumol disease work in practice, right through to the sense that represents an externalization, a marginalization of values that capitalism doesn't like to look at, in part because it is and remains a patriarchal structure.
Vielleicht korrigiere mich, weil du ja schon auch...
Correct me if I'm wrong, because you do reject capitalism. But what I hear from what you say is that rejecting capitalism is rather a strong feeling that we need to distribute the wealth a lot better, and it maintains the logic. And only if we establish the end of pipe logic, then if we share it with one another, then we do break the iceberg down below. So Haren Roy is a story where she's standing in a slum talking to a father with a sick child on his shoulders. And he said, I used to live in the jungle. We had more than 40 different fruits. And those fruits will never be handed over to my kids unless they steal them. But before this person, or in that situation, in the jungle, the people had the possibility to live very well without any money. And now the hunger statistics say, wow, this is progress. This person is now earning $1.90 to be just a little above the threshold of poverty. Because, of course, the goods always go there where there are people, and has to be an uncovered need, because otherwise market economy does not work out. And therefore, I'd like to dig a little deeper to say that we have to break down the logic of the market economy and of property, of ownership, and to question this a lot more.
Ich weiß nicht, ob ich genau verstanden habe, aber ich würde sagen.
I don't know if I got you fully right, but this is exactly what I'm saying. Well, great. So maybe let me just ask you a follow-up question. I'm a post-structuralist, since we do have those structures in our society and we are not working as individuals and are free to decide whatever we want to decide. And you have a lot nicer framings or phrasings for that, but the whole materialistic work is a construct, and I felt very close to what you say in your book. This call saying that everything is anthropogenic, that we are the ones who can change it. There is no structure that cannot be changed or no economy that may not be changed. Another similarity, Elon Musk does not seem to like us.
Tim hat eine Szene in seinem Buch, wo
Tim describes a scene in his book where Elon Musk reads out a text from Tim, and afterwards he said that the real war is not played out between up above and down below, but between expansionists and extinctionists. So those who want to keep on growing and those who are basically favoring destroying the earth. This should be us because we are pointing towards this being possible to happen. Doesn't really make sense. I don't consider myself an extinctionist, but how do you feel in the current situation where in the everyday news we see something so horrific that we couldn't even think about it possible yesterday?
It was definitely a moment where I mean, actually, to be honest, I don't think Elon Musk has read anything else that I've written, and certainly not. I doubt he even read that paper, to be honest. It was a paper, it was a multi-author paper, which I was one of the authors, and it was probably the paper that got both the most attention and the most hate within a very short space of time because of that one tweet from Elon Musk. But it does, in a way, it does. I mean, to be honest, in the book, I raised that as an issue because I kind of think, and maybe this is something that I've tried to do throughout the book in some sense, is to see both sides of the argument, to see, for example, you mentioned the conflict between germ theory and terrain theory, which was one of the things that brought down the old traditions of healing and medicine that had prevailed before the victory over the germ arrived with all these pharmaceutical products and the ability to isolate individual germs as the cause of all individual diseases and attack them in the laboratory with chemicals. And actually, you know, it's very easy sometimes to kind of throw out the other side of the argument. And even if you don't want to end up agreeing with the other side of the argument, it's I think, kind of important to just open the door to the other side of the arguments and say, where is this position coming from? What's the position? You know, what is the victory that germ theory claims for itself? And there are certain pharmaceutical products, as both you and I know, that are very good when it comes to the alleviation of pain or the treatment of some kinds of disease. And to differentiate the goodwill that comes behind that from the fact that we've followed a journey that possibly led by good intentions that has left us on the road to hell, as I describe it in the first chapter of the book. And this seems to be also, you know, potentially the case with something like the debate between expansionism and extinctionism, that there are two different kind of forces that motivate people. And extinctionism is obviously not the opposite of expansionism. What is the opposite of expansionism is something more like balance. And balance is a core concept for me through the book. The concept of balance is critical to health. The concept of balance is critical to planetary health. The concept of balance is critical to our psychological health. And so for me, the counterpose with expansionism is not extinctionism, but balance. But in characterizing that distinction, what it reveals, I think, is a kind of deep insecurity in the mindsets of people who think that only growth can save us, only expansion can save us, and neglect, as you point out, that actually in the pursuit of expansion you end up with extinction.
Die Frage würde sonst eh kommen vom Publikum. Bevor ich es jetzt öffne, frage ich jetzt doch.
Before I open the floor, my question to you, what do we do now with all that? What do you mean? What should we do?
Also, was sind deine Ansätze?
What would be your bullet points to change? Well, I'm really looking forward to the questions from the floor. And I'd like to say that this is a book that, for me, has been a real journey. And I hope that it is going to be at least part of the same for the readership. And this is a very important journey, maybe the most important one we are able to embark on. And thanks once again for the invitation.
Dann öffne ich jetzt. Also das hörte sich schon so nach.
So we do open the floor. This sounded as concluding words already, which there weren't. Anyone? Questions, comments?
Ja, noch einmal aufzeigen, bitte. Okay, ich gehe jetzt einfach mal so rum. Schön.
Ja, vielen Dank für diese
Thank you so much for this very
authentischen Einblicke.
authentic insights in the book, which I did not have the possibility to read yet, but I was very impressed by reading Prosperity Without Growth, and I thought that this is an issue that I did not read yet much. Prosperity Without Growth, put in the center was the idea of how we can save our planet considering the climate crisis, and your idea was that this would only be possible opening and expanding the care economy with jobs, because industrialization usually means less jobs. So where are the jobs are supposed to come from? And your arguments were that the care economy is the only industry branch that gives us CO2 neutral jobs and gives us a new perspective on life in order to be able to mitigate the loss of material things, learning that we were to benefit from this new economy. Now, the title does not really suggest it. I cannot really see the word of the planetary limits, climate change, or whatsoever. So what kind of importance, what is the significance of it in the book? I think we might just take 3 questions and then answer them all together.
I'll speak in English. Hi, Tim. I mean, obviously, as you know, I've been following your work and worked with you for a long time, and this question is one of where I want to sort of learn a little bit about how you see this framing and this work relating to some of the work that we've done in the past on well-being. And obviously, I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, so I can't. Maybe the answer's in there, but do you? There's a lot of people talking about a well-being economy, and I'm curious to hear how you see the relationship between these two concepts are. Are they two separate things? The well-being economy and the care economy is one part of the other. Are they competing? Just kind of, is it just a matter of framing and it depends on the context which term you use? And then similarly, I guess, regardless of what the answer to that is, in terms of, it sounds like health is much more central in this story than for example, well-being is. And again, is that a matter of framing, or is it a matter of a different sort of prioritization, or I guess? Yeah. And then a kind of a much more sort of a much easier question maybe, which is much more sort of pragmatic. Just this question about, and maybe again it's explained in the book, this question about Baumol's disease. Do you have a suggestion of how, because labour productivity does happen and will continue to happen, do you have a suggestion of how we can link labour productivity gains such that those gains in the productive sector can benefit the stagnant economy in the care sector as well?
Ich mache es wieder auf Deutsch. Hallo, mein Name ist...
I'll switch back to German. Feline Tecklenburg is my name. I'm co-chair of the association Economy is Care. And we have a leaflet out there sitting on the table. I sent you an email. I don't know if you had the chance to read it yet. I had the opportunity to read that book because I was asked to write a review on that. And I'd like to thank Friederike Habermann for her critical questions with a more feminist approach, because I was thinking that when I was reading it, not a lot is new. And who are the target groups? Definitely not feminists in the care sector or in the care movement. What I do think was a very rich and valuable thing, that capitalism is indeed intertwined with capitalism, and how health is destroyed by capitalism. But my uncomfort is the title and the framing, because I am worried that the focus is placed on health, moving away from the care work that is done on a daily basis. And this, once again, has to do with patriarchal structures. You're saying that health might be more interesting for men as a pick, and then I'm saying, well, yes, this is one of the stereotypes. So maybe men might more worried about their health and maintaining their body. And to say that if that is the care issue, I don't know if this is really of use for the care movement. And if it says Ökonomie der Fürsorge in German, and very few scenes are really talking about the burden of care for those people who deliver the care work, that the framework conditions are improved in our country. And this is something I'd like to debate with you, because the focus is on health and not on the comprehensive thing that is care. And if this is politically very positive. Another question, or are you satisfied with that?
Also erst Wohlstand und Wachstum. Yeah.
First of all, prosperity with that. Oh.
For me, certainly by the concerns about planetary health, about the environment, but I would argue also that, as I said before, that the theme of care economy, that the Cinderella economy, care, craft, creativity, communication, community, actually came out as one of the ways in which we should approach rethinking how the economy, what prosperity can possibly mean on a finite planet. And in the interim, actually, one of the things, part of the work that I've done in our research group is to show that actually this care economy has a very particular characteristic, two particular characteristics. One is in time intense. It's a labor-rich area of the economy, so it can employ people. The other is that it's, from its nature, typically more materially light. It's less carbon intensive, it's less materials intensive. Now, you look at those two characteristics and you say, isn't that an economy that we'd like to have? Because it's got the potential to employ people and it's got the potential to be a lower impact on the planet. And the data actually supports that idea. The difficulty is immediately that you are then drawn into the problem that labor richness, lots of employment for lots of people, goes right against that strict capitalist dictum of labor productivity and labor productivity growth, because one person's labor intensity is another person's high labor intensity is another person's low productivity growth. And so, you know, it led me, that idea of the care economy led me to some of the key themes that I explore from that earlier book in the later book. But you can rest assured that that overarching theme, actually, of planetary health is one of the aspects of health that I do want to look at in the book. It perhaps has a bit less space than it had in Prosperity Without Growth, but in some senses it internalizes that idea that our planetary health and our physical health and our physiological health and our psychological health and our community health are all deeply linked, and that there are places actually where in addressing the material and carbon intensity of our economic activity, we are offered directions of travel towards an economy that is less material intense, more labor intensive, and contributes directly to our quality of life, exactly where we would want to be if we wanted prosperity without growth. So I kind of feel, for me, it was very much part of the same journey and unpacking of that particular aspect of Wohlstand ohne Wachstum. Sama, thanks for your question. I do think a lot is in the framing. I mean, I start, when I start talking about health, I start with a framing from the WHO, which is a framing which in 1948 defined health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social societal well-being, and not just the absence of disease and infirmity. And I think it's not a totally flawless definition of health, but it's one that it connects directly to the work around the well-being economy. And I mean, I do think there's a lot of framing there. I think that the question is that economy, the care economy, the same as the well-being economy, depends a lot on who you might talk to in those people who associate themselves with either of those terms. And there is a danger, and I've seen that danger a little bit, that the well-being economy can mean so many obviously unassailably good things to so many people that you end up, I mean, there's one European document, you've probably seen it, which talks about the well-being economy is the growth economy. Well-being is dependent on growth. Growth is dependent on well-being, which at least acknowledges the link that growth is dependent on well-being, but creates a new link which says that well-being gives us growth. And so you're right back to the thing that you were trying to solve by coming up with terminology. And I know that's always tricky, and I'm not expecting the terminology of the care economy to solve it. And quite equally, it might be very corruptible and what's the word, enclosed by capitalist jargon, as anything else can be, although hopefully not, given some of the other conversations. And the last question, which I'm not sure where I stand with you on this, and I think I may need to think about it a little bit more closely, but I don't see so big a distinction between talking about care and talking about health as maybe you're suggesting, particularly when you include within the concept of health the idea of well-being, and particularly when you expand that to meaning physical and psychological and societal well-being. And so I don't think that and I wouldn't say I've prioritized this in the book, it is a clear theme within the book, but I don't think that theme that having that theme there diminishes my concern for exactly those concerns, those ideas that you're talking about, that the care work is denigrated, that care is denigrated, that care is seen as a part of a sector of society that is not prioritized. I mean, that's entirely within what I'm trying to do in the book, from the beginning right through to the end, where I talk about the policy shifts that might be necessary to reframe a care economy and to rescue us from a careless economy. And one of the arguments that I make there is that the careless economy, the care is an investment. Care is the investment in health and in well-being. And it goes for all of those activities, I think, that you were talking about. And that those investments really matter, and they should be taken seriously by government. They should be taken seriously within society. And when you do take them seriously, what you realize is that the careless economy owes a massive debt to the care economy, and that you must look for the ways in which you can repay that debt. You can repay that debt and stop it getting even greater because of the continuing denigration of care. And that, to me, seems... I'm not suggesting at all, it hasn't been said by others. In fact, most of my wish list for the care economy is drawn from the work of Riane Eisler, who wrote about the caring economy in one of her earlier books, and in The Real Wealth of Nations, and in The Chalice and the Blade. That Emma referred to this idea of a kind of partnership over domination as being a different kind of model for society to organize itself. Riane's formulae for a transition to a care economy and to support the role of care in the economy stand 30 years or so after she wrote them, and I make that point very, very explicitly in the book. But actually, those are arguments that we also need to repeat. We need to reach out. We need to put in front of Treasury, for example, because they are incredibly costly debts that are being incurred. And quite a lot of those debts are being incurred through a model of health and a use of the word care that we should not be agreeing with. And so a lot of my journey was finding a use of a framing of the word care that pays all the homage that is owed to the feminist literature that has pointed it out for so long, but which we can also take into an environment and say, this care that has been neglected and denigrated is on the back of a model of health which is rapidly making us all sick, and that is having enormous costs to the real economy. And that isn't the last or the first thing necessarily to say about care, but it's a very powerful thing to take into Treasury and say, look, you've created through your denigration of care, of looking after people, of basic provisioning, of provisioning decent whole food to people, you have legitimized an industry which is feeding people poison and systematically undermining the public health. And that's a potentially very powerful argument for saying that what we've inherited in the careless economy is not really an economy at all. It's certainly not an economy that's dedicated towards economic growth. It's dedicated towards what Herman Daly called uneconomic growth, and it is a deeply careless economy and a deeply false economy in the terminology of something that the Treasury might understand. And when you can point out, for example, in the UK, my country, the costs of food-related chronic disease, and I made this calculation outside the book, but it was for some work that I did for the Food Farming Countryside Commission, work out at £268 billion every year. These are just the food-related linked, the chronic disease costs related to food as just one example. And you can point that out to people that actually the careless economy is incurring a debt, not just a debt in terms of what's owed to carers, what's owed to women, what's owed to the people working in the care economy, but to the Treasury day in, day out. That becomes potentially a powerful argument for reorienting from within the belly of the beast, as well as attacking the beast from the outside. And I think for those reasons, I think that it's important to have and to retain a concept of care that can make those points, because they're very powerful points to make.
Dann machen wir weiter mit den Fragen.
Are there any more questions?
To pose a question about the security and economics in care, because you at the start made a point that you were wondering whether to write this book or not in a situation where we got such a dangerous environment all of a sudden that why should we talk about how we don't have time about like caring for other people. We have to solve real problems like wars and stuff. And I see, especially in our last election, that many people vote, for example, for like a strong economy in order to have a secure surrounding for their lives in particular. And I think there's a common, very successful interpretation of like security as we don't care and we don't have to care because we're so strong by ourselves that we can just impose a tariff on everybody else and go through it because we're so strong. And I listen to you, and I hope that your proposition is something else. Just like maybe security is that we do care, and that in situations where I cannot possibly ever pay anyone to do what I need, someone will still come and share a meal with me or whatever. So can you please talk about like the security that we need and maybe what the economy of care can actually provide in that sense? Thank you.
Sollen wir noch zwei oder eine andere Frage nehmen? Oder?
Wo war die andere?
Tim, let me say it in German, as you prefer. Meine Frage zielt auf den Aspekt.
My question aims at the aspect what has to do with the institutions, and I do not share the impression that reproductive work and the term is quite a central one, how societies reproduce, that reproduction is not rationalizable. Now our new kitchens can be rationalized. And if we look at the works from Van Dijk and Haugner, then we see that there is a room for maneuver, and this is economically founded. But what I would like to know, you were talking about the institutions and their central position to understand communities and societies. And one of the central institutions would be the family. Maybe you can share a few thoughts of this. Would this not be an anachronism, the classical bourgeois family and how they reproduce along the gender line?
Ich hab nicht so gut verstanden.
I did not really get it that well.
You were asking me whether the idea of a different locus for care is...
Ja, meine Frage ist, wenn wir an Reproduktions- und Reproduktionstheorien denken.
If we think about reproductive theories, starting out with Rosa Luxemburg up until newest studies, then one of the reproduction institutions would, of course, be the family. Yes, of course. And do you think that our family, in its bourgeois form, has a future? Shouldn't we think about it? Should we rethink it, you say?
Ja, ich verstehe jetzt, ja. Ja, ja.
Noch eine letzte Frage? Oder eine weitere Frage?
Hi, I was my area, my interest is often in technology, and obviously it's a very central part of the post-growth arguments. Is obviously technology is the main counter to that. Everything's going to be solved by technology, and you've talked about pharmaceuticals, which are obviously a technology in itself. I wondered if, in the care economy, you explored technology in a broader sense, and what kind of relationship you see between a thriving and flourishing care economy and technology. Is there one, or is there just simply less technology? I just wondered if that was part of your exploration.
Yeah. Okay. Hab die erste Frage vergessen. Was war der?
Fully forgot about the first question. Security, yes. I'll be coming back to you first.
Yes, and actually, even within some of the stories that I use, what I try to make clear is that actually we mustn't throw out the idea of technology entirely. And I don't think I ever did that in Wachstum ohne, wie heißt das? Wachstum, Wohlstand ohne Wachstum, danke, ja, ja. Oder in Wir wollen, wir leben. Ich habe das auch versucht zu erklären, das ist nicht gegen Technologie.
I have tried to explain that it's not against technology.
Against the idea of technologism. It's the argument against that technology will solve all the problems, even the problems that technology creates, because that to me has the sense of a kind of the dynamic of addiction. When you turn to the thing that creates the problems to try and solve the problems created by the thing you first thought of, then you're in the dynamics of addiction. And I don't think, so it is an argument against that dynamic, but it's not an argument against technology itself. And in one of the examples that I use actually, which is due to a public health writer called Anne-Marie Moll, who's written about this specifically as an issue, that in almost every particular health dilemma or dilemma around care that you want to, there's a book called The Logic of Care. And in her book, she makes the point very clearly that there are some conditions where technology has really enhanced quality of life, and to throw them away is actually a Missverständnis. But to keep the idea of technology in respect, but keep only the idea of technology, is also an error. And that's broadly the perspective that I take in the book as well, and also that, in those places where technology does lead to labour productivity, that the relationship between such activities and the care economy has somehow to be preserved, and that does mean tangible mechanism for repaying the debt that one owes to the other. Even in Wohlstand ohne Wachstum, actually, I talk not just about, and it was an important part of the argument, that it's not just that we look to technologies to save us from the environmental impact. Of course, we look to renewable energy. Of course, it's an important part of the solution space. but actually equally are non-technological solutions, social innovations, if you like, social technology, social reorganizations are as important a part of it. And pointing towards those has been consistently, through those 3 books, actually, has been a kind of theme of mine. The question of the family as the site of reproduction, yes, I think that does make sense that we should rethink that. And also the division, the kind of traditional division between the reproductive economy and the productive economy is something that we also have to rethink. I think we have to rethink the sites of both production and reproduction. And that there are certain parts of that rethinking that we can't entirely throw over. We can't yet, at least, and I hope never, throw over the idea that women bear children, but we can certainly question whether the organizational structure in which they are brought into the world follows the set dynamic that we've followed in the past. I agree that that's a reproductive idea, and one that I think has a lot to be said for it. On the question of security, yes. So just to say a little bit about my journey through this point, and to go back to Kathleen Lynch's very critical point that somehow care and violence are in antithesis to each other, that they live in a kind of almost continual sort of tension between care and violence. And my experience of watching that balance shift from a focus on care through the pandemic to the focus on what ultimately is violence in the world that is being painted for us by politicians at the moment, increasingly painted for us by politicians. And it's a world that I think offers us a quite distinct choice in terms of what security means. It's a difficult journey, and the book, in some ways, it's one of the most fascinating parts of my own journey through the book was coming to terms with this question of violence and trying to understand where it comes from in relation to care. And essentially it arises out of the fact that we don't just care for our physical health or for our physical well-being, we care for our symbolic well-being. We care about our reputation, we care about our status in society, we care about power, we end up caring about dominion in pursuit of power, and this pursuit of power leads us towards violence. And so actually, and it was one of the key things that I wanted to do in coming up with a definition, a functional, if you like, a dynamic definition of care as an organizing principle, that cannot be construed as care, even though it's sometimes framed as care, because it leads us to violence, because it leads us to instability, because it doesn't lead us towards health. And to come back to the question over here from Feline, that's precisely the reason for me of adopting a kind of definition of care as an organizing principle, is so that we can distinguish in these increasingly difficult, dangerous debates from what is presented to us as care, what's presented to us as security, from what is truly care, what is truly health, what is truly a balance. And to take the question of, the violence that we're being subjected to now and the extraordinary decisions that are being made, decisions like across the EU at the moment that we can afford to spend 800 billion euros rearming Europe, while we can only afford to spend 5.3 billion on the EU for Health, the flagship health-related project of the EU. And making sense of that decision, that sort of decision, it seems to me really important, and making clear that at this point we're faced with a choice between something which we can legitimately call care and something which usurps the language of care to push us deeper and deeper into conflict, to create the environment for violence. This is one of the reasons why, to me, I ended up thinking, you could look at this and say this is this fuzzy, nice, warm, beautiful language around care and love and solidarity is a trivial thing to do at this point in time because of everything that's going on around us, and actually saying the absolute opposite is true. There's no more important time at which we should be articulating these concepts, because we're faced with a distinct choice in relation to our to our security and maintaining our security. In one direction leads security. In the other direction, in the name of security, leads us towards a violence that will be ultimately destructive of life, property, and if in the worst circumstances, our civilization. With this choice is a very real choice, and how we think about security really matters.
Ja, wir kommen eigentlich schon zum Ende.
And with that, we already come to a close. I'd like to share a few words, and then you have the final word to say.
Damit wären wir am Ende der Zeit schon.
And we have consumed our time already.
Ich merke schon, dass ich
I feel that in between I'm thinking to myself, if we really talk about the same thing.
Jedenfalls mache ich auch die Erfahrung, dass es
according to my experience,
wird, was man sagt. Also wenn man
people do not always perceive to what has been said the way it's been said, or they don't listen the way that I was supposed to be listened to. You said okay, as opposed to other logic, and this would mean for me
die Markt- und Tauschlogik zu überwinden.
that according to Adam Smith, we have learned that people always exchanged goods. And it is shown that there has never been a society where people were really exchanging, bartering their goods. There were different logic. And I don't think there is a contradiction. You have nothing to exchange it for, so you have to starve. This happens to many millions of people, and I think this will keep on happening if it has something to do with redistributing, because what we generate with money destroys what happens below the water, and this is something that exponentially grows because of the reduction of profit. We have more materialistic content bounded to the GDP, and this is something that we have to overcome. In Germany, we have the distinction between ownership and property, and we are not all lawyers, and I am owning what I use and need, and my property would be what is like mine. So the landlord would be the one owning the property, and the one inhabiting it is the owner. So during the Roman slave ownership, the slaves used to be killed, and this goes along to you can destroy what is of others, and if you want to have what I do not need, but what is my own, and this has been the reasoning why people have gone down to the colonies for many years, and saying who does not produce a surplus and is not able to sell on the market cannot be in a position to own property. And this affected societies that, because of respect for life, would only take out of nature what the community needed, and were definitely not thinking about making surplus and selling them off. And I think those are these fundamental logics that we have to break with. And this is the perspective that I might not be able to find in your writing. And everything that we need to do, of course, we are there to find the right place for our care endeavors. But I think back then, during the pandemic, we had a launch of the Network of Economic Change with Silke Helfrich for Commons and Christian Ferber for the Common Good Economy and Tia Schmelze for Degrowth and others. And back then we said we would like to launch different alternative economic approaches, but we do say that we have to push back the logic of the market economy on each and every level of society. We want to find a way that we have to replace the market with democracy. And then what we do is to create more commons and to have more clarity on where we have to go. This is something that I might be lacking in your book.
Interessante Frage, noch eine.
An interesting question.
What would I say? I mean, to some extent, it describes my professional life struggle. To what extent do you take up arms against a distinct enemy and create alternative conditions that must then be seen as overthrowing that enemy and superseding everything, the logic that came before? To what extent should you go and navigate those conflicts inside the belly of the beast? I started, if you like. I mean, I didn't start my professional career in the belly of the beast, but when I was economics commissioner for the Sustainable Development Commission, acting as economics commissioner as an advisor to the UK government, you could certainly argue that I was inside the belly of the beast, and so I was definitely, you know, saying things to the realpolitik of the time, which were not the same things I was saying when I started out as an activist with Friends of the Earth and was, you know, demonstrating against corporate power in the days when Friends of the Earth used to do that, and a few souls who have experienced the same difficult path understand perhaps what I mean there. But my point is that along the way, I have seen both of those as legitimate strategies and neither of them as particularly uniformly successful. And I wouldn't really purport to know, and I don't think I'm making that case that I have a definitive strategy of what the right thing to do is. I'm profoundly grateful that there are people, you know, out there making very distinct points that the structure of the market is wrong, that it's complete, it has to be overthrown in favor of the commons. I'm also grateful that there are people inside the structure of the market, many of whom I have worked with over the years, as well as those outside, who are trying to change that system from within. And I think both of those sets of people are absolutely vital to making the transformations that I think we both agree on. But you said this to me actually before we met, and I think I have reframed it. I've captured it. I've enclosed it as an element of my own arguments. But it is this, that actually if there's one thing that I want the book to do is to be able to create a space for conversation where we may not agree, and actually creating those spaces where we have the potential not to disagree. I think this is entirely you, is the foundation for thinking about change.
Thank you very much.